This is the final episode before yes, I'm going to say the words, presidential inauguration. And yes, I know that gives some of you PTSD. Look, some people are excited about this. And I totally get being over the lies of the left. But of course, none of that erases the fact that Trump lies incessantly. Today, I'm going to discuss the way forward for truth. And I actually have an optimistic message because really, this should not be about politics or about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican. If you care about truth, then we should really all be on the same side of that. And there is something we need that I believe we can make happen together. It begins with calling out the hypocrisy of news organizations that are promising to be guardians of truth in this new era. As part of this, I'll talk you through something that so many listeners have been asking me about: Meta, the parent company of Facebook, dropping its fact-checking system. When you look at this move based on what fact-checking is supposed to be, you see it very differently from how the mainstream media is portraying it. Plus, why a super popular band's name change is significant for this time we're living through. And I have a message for you about Martin Luther King Day. All that ahead on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. My name is Josh Levs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news. Before we jump into today, a message to those of you who are in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area, and living through these fires. My thoughts are with you, and I know that many people around the country and around the world share those sentiments. I know that some of you listeners have lost your home, lost your possessions. It's heartbreaking, and I hope you are staying safe. I am keeping an eye on the role of the media in all this, and I'd love to hear from you about what you are finding helpful or problematic with the media. There is a form at my website, joshlevs.com, that anyone can fill out, any listener. You can send me information there, your thoughts, your comments, any links you want me to check out. I encourage you to find that. Again, it's at joshlevs.com. As all of you may know, or those of you who are new probably don't, with each episode, I also send out a newsletter, often more than one newsletter, filled with links and more information about the things that I talk about on this show. The newsletter is free. Anyone can get it, and I encourage you to. I don't expect anyone to take my word for anything. Plus, I often write about steps that you can take to reach the media and show them what they're doing wrong. Those who choose to become paid subscribers get additional content. And if you are a paid subscriber to the newsletter, then you can message me directly there and you can jump into the comments, all that stuff. For those of you who don't know, I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN. I became lead on-air fact checker. And throughout all that time, I saw so many problems in the news, so many inaccurate things that get reported as though they are true. In this show, I point to those and the systemic issues that make so many problems with the news media continue. Since I left CNN, I give a lot of speeches, and I'm often introduced as being a, quote, nonpartisan fact checker. I don't say anything when people call me that. I understand how they mean it, but I always think it's so sad that that term even exists in people's minds, because facts are not partisan. Facts are facts. The earth is round. There are facts that just exist. But sadly, we have gotten so lost in party politics and partisanship and political tribes. Plus, we've gotten lost in narratives and opinions and theories, all this stuff that obscures facts. And now we are hitting a turning point. Look, all politicians lie. It is also the case that Trump is the most mendacious politician I've ever seen from any party. His lies are extreme, and he issues them at such a rapid pace, you can't even keep up with the onslaught. We are in store for a wild ride in that sense from the White House. Media are vowing that their agencies will serve as some kind of bulwark or will do the hard work of standing up for truth. Here's one clip. This was from Ari Melber on MSNBC talking about these uber wealthy, powerful tech leaders who have caved to Trumpism.
It's precisely the power of truth, of facts, of reporting, especially when powerful forces are not held accountable by other dynamics, that makes this such a big story. It's why Jeff Bezos bought the Post. It's why Trump wants to control these forces, the press, and the people who might be subjected to learn some facts about him or his government, past, present, or future. It's why your knowledge of these facts matters.
I agree that people should not give in to those forces, and the news media should fight for truth. But I've also covered lies that have aired on MSNBC, especially by one of their hosts, Joy Reid. So everything that Ari said there should be turned inward inside MSNBC as well, when it fails to stand for truth and holding powerful forces accountable. Here's a clip from Christiane Amanpour on CNN.
One freedom often taken for granted is under threat, and that is freedom of the press. Activist groups warn that Donald Trump's second term further endangers this essential right. Globally, the stakes are even higher. In conflict zones, telling the truth often costs journalists their lives.
She's right that Trump does endanger freedom of the press. He uses any tool he can get his hands on to crack down on media and threaten media. His lies are very problematic. He inspired violence with his lies about the 2020 election. He does use the dictator's handbook to get people to turn against the news. I call out actual fake news. He calls real news fake news and fake news real news. That sentence sounded Dr. Seuss-ish, but you know what I mean. Anyway, Christiane is talking about the importance of telling truth in conflict zones. Well, sure, that's important. But she has been calling Al Jazeera, Qatari state-run propaganda, a source of truth about what goes on in conflict zones, including in Gaza. And it's very much not. She used her platforms to accuse Israel of intentionally killing an Al Jazeera journalist, even though there's no evidence for it. This journalist was in a dangerous area amid crossfire. Christiane has talked about that one killing over and over while never mentioning by name the many, many, many journalists killed in war zones all over the world, including ones who were definitely targeted. That's not what you do when you care about truth, which requires facts plus context. She's also been lying about the term international law for years. Even in this same episode with the clip I just played you, she had on these two filmmakers, one Palestinian, one Israeli, who is part of a far left-wing movement that pushes the apartheid lie about Israel. It is not a matter of opinion. Israel is the only country in the Middle East and North Africa with equal democratic rights for citizens. But she does not challenge him on his ridiculous apartheid claim. And then she said this.
When you presented this film at the Berlin Film Festival, where you won Best Documentary, your speech was immediately condemned by one or more German officials as being anti-Semitic. How do you account for that?
I was very outraged by that because,
What a journalist should do in a case like that is bring up what he actually said and fact check it and look at why some German officials called it anti-Semitic and discuss it. But nope, she just gave yet another person space to push the whole Jews cry wolf about anti-Semitism myth, which I did an episode about. The same kind of hypocrisy is in print media as well. There's a piece in Time, and it's a good piece. It's by former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. The headline is Defending the Truth in a Second Trump Term. And that does need to be done. The truth should be defended. But Time, meanwhile, ran a piece filled with holes from people trying to justify Hamas death toll figures from Gaza. I contacted Time. I pointed out the reasons that it makes no sense, but they did nothing. They didn't fact check it. They didn't pull back. They didn't add a line or run a correction. So these news agencies are presenting themselves as these great defenders of truth from Trump's attacks, but they refuse to defend truth from other attacks, ones that are considered left-wing in America, because somehow people on the far left have glommed onto these Islamist movements backed by Iran that are also aimed at destroying democracies. People are understandably sick of mainstream media calling out Trump's lies while parroting Hamas claims as truth. So, why am I optimistic? Here's why. The fact that people are fed up is in and of itself promising. Big sweeping changes, especially in America, take place at a cultural level, outside of politics. The pendulum swings in culture. Remember how after Trump's election in 2016, America had these giant women's marches, then the Me Too movement took off, Black Lives Matter, and these movements, by the way, don't have to be perfect. They were very not perfect. In fact, Women's March organizers and Black Lives Matter organizations have massive problems, including with anti-Semitism. But outside of organizational levels, the movements themselves still had and have important ideas at their core about justice. I did an event with Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement. She's awesome. So there are cultural forces that react to what's happening in politics. I looked at whether the mainstream media have talked about this whole idea that political movements can lead to counter movements. The first one that turned up is interesting. It included a discussion of this.
It's a quarter after one. I'm all alone and I need you now.
A music group now known as Lady A, formerly known as Lady Antebellum. They changed their name in 2020, saying they were, quote, regretful and embarrassed to say that we did not take into account the associations to the period of history before the Civil War, which included slavery. In 2020, CNN had on two guests discussing this. They're commentators, Errol Lewis and Angela Rye.
This is the whole culture changing, and it's in some ways analogous to what we've seen with same-sex marriage. It was impossible until it was normal. The shifts like this don't come along very often, but when they do, it puts a politician like Donald Trump in a very difficult position. You can fight against an opponent. It's very hard to fight against a movement. It's even harder to fight against a cultural shift.
Angela, the Louisville City Council in Kentucky last night, 26-0, voted to end no-knock warrants. I don't even know if many of us knew that there was such a thing as a no-knock warrant until Breonna Taylor was killed. They did the right thing yesterday.
It is an amazing thing that this law was passed and so quickly.
Cultural movements can lead to substantial change in society. What we need is a radical cultural movement for truth, one that tells politicians and these big mainstream news outlets that we see through them, that they have been failing to stand for truth for so long. If we grow demand from the ground up for hard, concrete truth, facts plus context, imagine what could happen. These news agencies, seeing this demand, might actually respond. Just as a lot of businesses came forward and said, you know what, we have been part of the problem with racial disparities in America, we need to take action. Imagine if news agencies said, okay, we hear you, we have not done enough to stand for truth, and now we will. We're going to change our systems so that we provide you with just things that we have fact-checked, and we'll fire people who have infiltrated our ranks to push their agendas, whether from the far right or the far left, and we'll correct things when we find out we were wrong. We as Americans can push a movement for truth. Coming up later in the show, I'm going to talk about how I think we can make this work. But first, so many of you have asked me about Meta's role in all this now that it is dropping its fact-checking operation. Over the holidays, I had a little time to go through testimonials from listeners, people who support this show, and I want to take a minute to share some of these with you that you might not have heard or seen, and to thank these folks. Here's one. Josh uses his unique fact-checking skills and experience not only to expose falsehoods in the news, but to dismantle the systems that drive them. He shows us how to put truth first. That's from Pamela Meyer. She gave one of the top TED Talks of all time. You might have seen it, How to Spot a Liar. Josh is poised to hold powerful voices accountable because he is one of those powerful voices. They Stand Corrected is the standard of truth in an era defined by uncertainty and misinformation. And this is from Michelle Azrael, a writer, editor, and producer at network levels. Denise Hamilton, she's the author of Indivisible. She wrote, "Your voice is so important. I'm glad you have decided to apply your expertise to this space." This one came from the Elie Wiesel Foundation. They Stand Corrected is an important contribution to understanding how media bias has turned too many otherwise thoughtful and informed individuals against the Jewish people. And then there's this one from the head of a chapter of National Parents Organization. This is an audio testimonial from Christian Pash, who is chair of the Virginia chapter.
I really enjoyed listening to your podcast. And more than that, I've really enjoyed and been thankful for your fact-driven and data-centric approach. Whether it's in the paid leave, shared parenting, or fatherhood space, or in the general arena of holding folks accountable, conversations like the ones you are having and leading are critical, especially during these times. Thanks for what you do.
Messages like this mean so much, especially when they come in the form of reviews for the show. Here's one from Apple Podcasts, which just blew me away. The only podcast I regularly must listen to. It helps me feel reassured that in a world that can feel chaotic and wild, there are people working very hard to advocate for truth and justice. I always leave feeling better informed and also motivated to be a part of the change that we need to help us all connect on the most fundamental levels. An absolute must listen for all. This is so humble brag when I read this stuff, but I have promised people that I will read them. And when you submit yours, I will read yours as well. This fuels me. It helps me keep going through all the hard work of putting together this podcast. Thank you. As soon as this happened, I began hearing from listeners.
Facebook and Instagram's parent company, Meta, announced today it's ending third-party fact-checking on its platforms, calling the decision a return to a, quote, fundamental commitment to free expression.
That's a report from PBS about Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg announcing that the company was ending its fact-checking content moderation system.
We've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech.
That is basically the language of today's Republican Party that he's using there. Trump has, of course, threatened big media and social media platforms. In a book, he even threatened to imprison Mark Zuckerberg if he did anything illegal. And now Trump is about to have a lot of tools at his disposal. In a news conference, Trump was asked about this announcement.
Meta, Facebook, I think they've come a long way.
Do you think he's directly responding to the threats that you have made to him in the past?
Probably. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, the moves probably were in response to Trump. And that is awful. Private companies should not be making decisions about fact-checking based on fear of a political leader. But the hand-wringing about this from the media ignores their own problems. There are dozens of headlines saying Facebook has caved, this is so bad for truth, and lots of individual journalists in big mainstream news agencies have been posting about this and saying that. The lack of self-awareness is so obvious. Here's a segment from CBS. They have something called CBS Confirmed, which claims to be covering misinformation and empowering people to differentiate fact from fiction. They had this conversation between an anchor and a leader of CBS Confirmed. At first, they discussed problems with what Facebook is replacing this with. It will now be a community notes system similar to what X has, which is formerly known as Twitter.
The company says an algorithm takes a look at the ideological spectrum of all of those contributors who voted. If they deem that those voters are diverse, it gets published. If the algorithm determines that the people who voted that note was helpful are not diverse enough, the public never sees it. And this is where critics say that in theory, community notes sounds great. But in practice, it allows for a lot of misinformation and false information to be rampant on the platform without the public knowing any better.
Then they got into how people can check information.
First is to check the source. Is a person or publication who's posting something reliable? You want to check the context. We are all guilty of seeing posts on social media, catchy headline, and sharing it without actually clicking in to read the details and make sure that it's accurate and said in context. Then you also want to just cross-check your information, right? If you see something on social media, Google it, see what other news outlets are saying about it. I saved this for last, but it's really the most important is check your emotions.
That would be all well and good if CBS itself was doing that. Recently, listeners to this show voted in what I called the Media Fail Awards. CBS won the category for worst single fail of the year for a broadcast news agency. It was from this disastrous thing they did in which they punished journalism. They had on this biased writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who lied about Israel. And then when one anchor tried to introduce some context, CBS punished that anchor. Meanwhile, CBS praises its own people for introducing their emotions, like in reporting about racism in America. But they went after this anchor, saying he should have put his own biases aside, which didn't even make sense because he was not talking about his experiences or emotions. He was only doing journalism, but got punished for that. Yes, it's as messy as it sounds. I'll link to the previous episode I did about that in the newsletter. Anyway, that whole segment I just described, guess where I first saw it? Not on TV, on Instagram, which is part of Meta. And there were no fact-checking notes around it, nothing. So this fact-checking operation they've had has not touched stuff like that. These news organizations have had false stuff with no context and no corrections on those platforms throughout this time that Facebook has allegedly been supporting fact-checking. Since we're talking about the web, on this show, I usually talk about the largest mainstream news outlets, but there are outlets that exist exclusively on the web or overwhelmingly primarily on the web. Take this one, for example, Vox.com. The website put out a piece headlined, "The Danger of Meta's Big Fact-Checking Changes." Meanwhile, Vox itself had possibly the worst, like literally actual worst, so-called explainer of Israel and Gaza shortly after the October 7th attacks. There have been a bunch of breakdowns of just how bad it was. I'll post one in the newsletter, a particularly good one from a group called Honest Reporting. They call this Vox video a masterclass in victim blaming. Vox got basic things wrong and left out context, which is another way of lying, from the very beginning of it. Like, here are just 2 sentences from it.
The Prime Minister of the Israeli occupation, Benjamin Netanyahu, he knows very well that people are not able to leave.
The Gaza Strip is the smaller of the 2 Palestinian territories occupied by Israel since 1967.
There is no prime minister of occupation. That terminology is what Islamists want people to call Israel because they want people to hold Israel to an entirely different set of standards, claiming that Israel itself, in its entire existence, is some sort of occupation, while ignoring where literally all other nations come from. As I've reported before, Israel left Gaza in 2005, and the Palestinian Authority, in documents to the United Nations about Jericho, has said that the Israeli occupation there ended in 1994. I know it sounds confusing, but short version, Vox is just way off, of course. And places like Vox don't care about getting facts like this wrong because these kinds of claims suit their preferred victim narratives. That disastrous Vox so-called explainer is on Facebook with no corrections, no fact checks, no context, no nothing. So you see, there's already been this problem with the system in place. I looked at the list of agencies that have been part of the network that Facebook has been using as part of its fact-checking system. Here are 2 of them, Reuters and USA Today. Both of those agencies get things wrong all the time and don't correct them. I just contacted Reuters last week asking about 2 things they had in one story that made no sense. You will, of course, be shocked to know that I have not heard back. And they post these stories on social platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. So here's the deal. If these agencies held themselves to account for their lies and misleading statements about so many things, like take the exit polls. I did a couple of episodes about how these news agencies were making all these claims about exit polls in the election, including giving Trump credit for these alleged big advancements with certain demographics, even though all of that data might not be legit and is definitely untrustworthy. But they put this stuff on Facebook and Instagram, and no one did anything about it. So if these agencies held themselves to account and were truly fact-checking, then I would be all for keeping in place what they had on Facebook. But that's not happening. So the current system wasn't working either. What does work? What do we need to do? That is coming up. Welcoming a new sponsor to They Stand Corrected, LeaderWorks. News stories are often about big things happening on the national or global stage. But what matters most to people, what makes the biggest difference in their lives, is usually about what's most immediate: their family and friends, and their work. Surveys show that more than ever, people want meaning at work. They care about meaning even more than salary. But meaning doesn't just happen spontaneously. There's a science to it. When organizations learn how to build their workplaces around meaning, employees are happier, more satisfied, more productive, creative, collaborative, all these great things. So, at LeaderWorks, their experts help organizations transform. They do more than just coaching and consulting. They deliver a comprehensive, data-driven approach that helps people lead with purpose, speed, and impact. President and managing partner Clint Cofford had this great piece in Fortune about his time at Nike and why he went and did a doctoral dissertation about meaningful work. Learn more at leaderworks.co. We live at a time in which two things are true. There is an unprecedented avalanche of lies and disinformation from all sides. And there is unprecedented access to information. And of course, those things go hand in hand. People are overwhelmed with content from the moment they get up to the moment they go to bed, and cannot be expected to have to stop at all times in their days to fact check everything they are told. Since I launched this show, I've been working to focus on the most dangerous lies, the ones that lead to violence, the ones that are causing the biggest problems. And I'm going to continue to do that. At all times, the key is to figure out what's most important. And you help with that. Every time I hear from you, whether it's through the newsletter or the form in my website, and you send in things, you say, I need to know if this is true. I want to know if this is true. You are pointing me in the right direction. And you inspire most of these episodes. As you heard, listeners are the reason that I knew I needed to jump on this meta thing this week. Cultural movements start with people like you and me. They don't generally start with people at the top. The more people join us in this effort to stand for truth, the more people join this effort to be part of this They Stand Corrected community, the more we can do to hold all sides accountable. Big media still have big power. They will respond if they see more and more people demanding change. In some of my newsletters, I offer language that you can send to news executives, telling them why you're not okay with their lies and why they need to change what they're doing. This is how you build a movement. To whatever extent I can help do this through my little podcast here and the newsletter I put out, I am happy to. And for those of you who are social warriors in a good sense, you let me know what we can do to further this. Inauguration Day is also this year Martin Luther King Day. For many years, I covered the annual service at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where I live. I covered that for NPR for a while. Martin Luther King said some very interesting and powerful things about the role of truth. Here is a little bit from his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech.
I accept this award in the spirit of a curator of some precious heirloom, which he holds in trust for its true owners, all those to whom truth is beauty and beauty truth, and in whose eyes the beauty of genuine brotherhood and peace is more precious than diamonds or silver or gold.
Beauty is truth and truth beauty. Yes. By the way, Martin Luther King Jr. said fantastic things about another topic I discuss on this show, Israel and Jewish history, the importance of supporting Israel and Zionism. These days, groups that perpetrate and support Islamist terrorism try to erase that. And the mainstream media, of course, helps them very often. It's rare to find mainstream news organizations these days even acknowledging on Martin Luther King Day the great things that he said about the importance of Israel, even as they segue from segments about Martin Luther King right into their latest screeds against Israel. In fact, the American Jewish Committee was one of the sponsoring committees of the March on Washington, where he gave the I Have a Dream speech. The AJC said Black people would win this revolution and that it is the soul of America which is at stake. Anyway, I'll be keeping an eye on how the media handles this, if at all, this year. All right, folks, as we face this turning point, let's work together to spread truth. Remember to subscribe, rate, review, get the newsletter. All these things make a huge difference. And I'm assigning you all the task of getting at least 1/10 of humanity to join us in this They Stand Corrected community. How about if I give you until next week? Is that enough time? Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.